Captain America Civil War is probably my favorite MCU film, at least until I remember another one that I liked more. I think there's a lot you can take away from its themes and choices, and that Joe and Anthony Russo did a great job at making this dense story very engaging and effective. For reasons I will explain, it's also the go-to counterexample I like to bring up when people mention that comic book fans always want things to be more like the source material. I do feel like I appreciate this movie more because I'm pretty familiar with the original comics, though maybe not for the reasons you'd think. For all my fellow dank nerds who've also read Civil War and don't really feel like rehashing that trauma, oh yes, that's where we're going with this, feel free to skip forward to the time below for my analysis of the actual movie that this video is about. But in my opinion, you can't really grok how well the movie pulls off its tricks without also understanding how, oddly the book did it. So if you haven't read the OG Civil War or just want to hear my review of it, sit back and enjoy my pain. Big comic book events where tons of different superheroes all get together to do something for some reason have always been a pretty common thing at Marvel and DC. And even by the standards of event comics outright being a thing that happened occasionally, the early 2000s were especially rife with event comics, all happening on top of each other, all of them being marketed as so very epic and important and nothing will ever be the same. And in the summer of 2006, oh my god, 2006 was 15 years ago, Marvel Comics released the first issue of Civil War, a major crossover event written by Mark Millar. Mostly. The basic gist of the story was that some superheroes were on a mission where something went very badly very publicly, and a bunch of people died as a result. This kinda annoyed a bunch of other people, including the government, who then made a bunch of laws regulating superheroes, basically saying that you can't go out and fight crime in a costume unless you worked for the US government. Different superheroes agreed or disagreed with this law, and things escalated from there, involving just about every corner and every character of the Marvel Universe, throwing all your favorite action figures at each other and having them go violently hog wild. Millar's Civil War was a big success for Marvel in terms of profit and just pure hype. Remember, this was back in the big boiling point heyday of these event comics, and Marvel got a lot of traction from promising and generally delivering some game-changing storylines that went into and came out of this event, including but not limited to Spider-Man revealing his secret identity to the world, Captain America dying, and half the entire rest of the company's characters becoming fugitives from the law. So, to bury the lead a bit, it's not surprising that Marvel Studios ended up supposedly changing whatever plans they originally had for Captain America 3 in order to adapt Civil War for the big screen. I know some people wish that we got to have a proper third Captain America film to focus more directly on Steve Rogers instead of this big crossover event that included every body, but I completely see why they went this route, and honestly, it was the right choice. That being said, while the comic book Civil War was a financial success, critically speaking it ended up being about as divisive as the actual Registration Act in the story itself. And yeah, personally, I very much lean towards the side that finds the book pretty shabby in terms of both intent and execution. A lot of the story focused on the ideological rift between these two factions that were either for or against extreme government oversight over superheroes, but the actual social politics of the storyline were very ham-fisted, even for its time, and Marvel and Millar ended up painting the pro-registration side of the war as redonkulously vile pretty much right from the outset, so that there was even less nuance in a story that tried so very hard to be nuanced. Like, hey, remember Maria Hill? Everyone likes her nowadays because she's Nick Fury's right-hand agent and also Robin from that show and also Stumptown, but in the first issue of Civil War, she was the trigger-happy bureaucrat who drew guns on Captain America for not following a law that hadn't been passed yet. And then, like, it was hard enough to root for the team that supported her squad of cape killers, yes, that's what they called themselves, without those people also, A, making a robot clone of Thor that ended up murdering someone, B, putting superheroes in an extra-dimensional prison that sucks their will to live without any due process whatsoever, And see, defending these actions because of the numbers told them to do this, they made some graphs, Nate Silver tweeted some stuff. It also didn't help that no one seemed to agree on just what exactly registering superheroes actually meant. See, Civil War wasn't contained to just the primary 7 issues. The story also spread over to all the books of all the characters who were involved in the event, which was like everyone, and a whole bunch of tie-in specials and even whole separate stories created just for the event, which means that Mark Millar wasn't the only writer establishing this story. Just about every writer at Marvel Comics got to pitch in. That's honestly pretty common for event comics, but Marvel didn't seem to have shared any sort of story bible with their writers or editors explaining just what exactly the Superhuman Registration Act would actually entail, which is kind of a big deal if your entire story is about this law and why characters like it or don't like it. As a result, all these different books are contradicting each other about the Registration Act, and we're not just talking about obscure legal technicalities or whatever, we're talking about very basic questions of what the law even does. Are superheroes allowed to just retire and live as a civilian if they don't want to work for the government? Some books said yes, other books said no. Does this apply to all people wearing a costume and mask or just those with superpowers? Who knows? To this day, you could likely ask 5 Marvel writers what the Registration Act actually did and get 5 different answers. The most notorious instance is probably when Iron Man tells Spider-Man in his book that the aforementioned super prison is a permanent solution to anyone who disagrees with the law, and then in the next issue of the main book tells him that it's a temporary solution. How does that happen? How do you get permanent and temporary mixed up? By the end, what we're left with is just kind of an obnoxious, incoherent story where the so-called shades of gray mostly just come from how unpleasantly characters keep acting. One side goes on and on about principles and freedoms and values, and the other side maintains that they're in the right because of McCarthyism? The personal stakes of it all come down to very impersonal drives like, the law is right, or the law is wrong, or hey, sometimes if we're lucky, a character's motivation might be something like, I don't want to go to prison. It's basically a story about characters fighting over politics, where their very ideology defines them and becomes their entire identity. So, when Marvel Studios decided to adapt this comic for the MCU, they changed f***ing everything. They took one look at all that and said, hell with this, we're gonna do our own thing. And that too was the right choice. There's a lot we could point out about the political backdrop of Marvel Cinematic Universe's The Russo Brothers' Captain America Civil War. The Sokovian Accords, which is this film's version of the Superhuman Registration Act from the comics, establishes a lot of this film's stakes, and we can read a lot of ideological nuance and real-world implications from it. If you're interested in that stuff, I definitely recommend the linked video essay by Renegade Cut, which does a fantastic job exploring the good and bad parts of this depiction, where it makes sense, where it doesn't, where it applies to our own world, etc. What I'm here to tell you, instead, is that all of that stuff does not actually matter. That's not the point of Captain America Civil War, and for good reason. Alright friends, real talk time. Here's the deal. In real life, politics are very important. In real life, you should be invested in social politics. You should be politically active. You should vote in every single election for the rest of your lives. And you should vote to improve people's lives. You should vote for affordable care. You should vote in favor of social justice. In fiction, though, in these stories that we made up to entertain each other with, it's really hard to make politics compelling. It just is. Political issues generally come across as clinical and impersonal, not really something you want to hang the heart of your story on, and a lot of stories that seem on the surface like they are driven by politics actually aren't. And I can already feel a lot of the polite, sensible disagreements that you're about to think at me, so let me just toss down a bunch of caveats real quick. Yes, there are tons of good stories about real-life politics and real-life issues. Lots of very smart people who knew what they were doing have told thought-provoking stories about social issues that have stood the test of time. Even in comics, these stories have always existed. And I'm not just talking about the major graphic novels like Watchmen or Red Son. Some of my favorite takes on superheroes are just the regular issues that envision these big spandex-clad muscle people having to navigate real-world issues and real-world political systems as just another part of being a superhero. One of my biggest pet peeves is comics or TV shows with bad takes on law. I'm looking at you, The Flash, a show I stopped watching because these people have no understanding of human rights whatsoever and no one cared. So I'm not saying don't put politics in a story. What I'm saying is that it's really hard to put politics in a story, and the not-so-secret trick is that politics in a story are only as engaging as the characters through which the story is told. And characters are more than their politics, to the point that it gets kind of weird if politics are the only thing that someone thinks about, even in a very politically relevant story. To go back to Alan Moore's Watchmen, this book gets cited as one of the most political comics around, and it is, but there are also entire multiple chapters of the book focused entirely on character work. At its heart, Watchmen is an intimate murder mystery, one where the victim wasn't some random stranger. Everyone in this book knew the comedian, and incidentally, everyone is a suspect, which makes the stakes absolutely personal for every character. Yes, Moore does blab a lot of words here about how Cold War jingoism is really bad, but he was writing a story and the narrative was very character-driven. If Moore wanted to only blab a lot of words about political stuff he thinks and nothing else, he'd probably make a video essay instead. On another end of the spectrum for us nerds, A Song of Ice and Fire is praised for its vivid world-building and cutting political backdrop. But no one cared about this story because how much feudalism are we gonna end up with is such a riveting plotline. They cared because the nice family with the nice kids got broken up and put into danger by the evil bad family. And come on, don't you feel bad for this poor girl who's mistreated by her brother?
Hello, darkness, my old...
Yes, the political backdrop is important because there's no plot or setting without it, but more often than not, it's not what's driving the story. Hunger Games, easy example. Katniss hates the Capitol. She would love to overthrow it. She's got political ideology leaking from her eyes. But all of that is incidental to and inextricable from how much she cares about her sister, her family, and her friends. Spoiler alert, the most political decisions she makes in this story are entirely motivated by her relationships with her loved ones. And that's right, dear clever listeners, this is where I finally get to my point about Civil War. Steve Rogers, the captain of the America, does not agree with the Sokovian Accords. He gives valid reasons for why he doesn't agree with the Sokovian Accords. But his ideological disagreement with a law is not the conflict of his story. It is not the reason he ends up a fugitive. Now, if the Accords were the crazy draconian nonsense that the Registration Act was in the original comics, Steve would probably be more fussed about it here purely out of principle. But the writers went another direction with this film. These Accords are not ridiculous. There are still some big problems with them, but not so much that Steve was going to punch people about it. He did consider retiring instead of fighting the law, and when he admits that he would never retire as long as people needed him,
Hello, darkness, my old...
he did consider compromising with the Accords. Politics, ideology, opinions, these things can round out a character, but a character that is only these things run the risk of being one-dimensional. And sometimes the comic book Captain America does have this reputation of being so defined by his ideology that he becomes nothing more than a man-shaped patriotism dispenser. Which is understandable, that's his shtick. Captain America was conceived as a symbol, as an elemental representation of idealized American values, which is obviously very political and rightly so. But for a long time, Cap being inseparable from this symbolism of America hurt the character a bit, made him little more than a mouthpiece for inspirational slogans. It's not that Captain America never had good stories before, but still, who is this person? Who is Steve Rogers, the character? Well, starting in 2005, oh my god, 2005 was 16 years ago? Writer Ed Brubaker helmed his 50-issue run on the Captain America book, which is considered by many readers to be, I'm not gonna mince words here, one of the best takes on the character ever. A run that really helped to define Steve as an engaging character beyond just his symbolism. A run that was very likely the primary inspiration for Steve's narrative in the MCU. And one of the major storylines of that run was the Winter Soldier saga. Enter Bucky. Why does Steve Rogers end up disobeying the Accords and becoming a fugitive? Why does he act with so little regard for a law that was enacted in part because of him, literally so that Steve Rogers couldn't just do whatever Steve Rogers wanted to do without consequences? He does it to help his friend. He does it because a theoretical ideological disagreement has become an immediate practical threat to someone he cares about. He does it because now the stakes are personal. I don't think the Russo brothers are suggesting that their Captain America is a non-political person or that the characters in this film just don't care about the law. But what this film does an excellent job of depicting is that, regardless of a character's ideology, it's their personal stakes, relationships, and dynamics that will ultimately determine what they end up doing when it comes down to the wire. Heck, even Steve's actual ideology ended up being reinforced by the words of someone close to him, so there's a deeply personal drive behind his political stance. This is engaging. This is something everyone can relate with. And Civil War does such a good job of depicting this because they depict this through almost every single character. The other obvious cases of this are, of course, Tony Stark's personal guilt fueling his support for the Accords, and T'Challa's personal grief fueling his support for beating the shit out of Bucky. But it goes even beyond that. Like, it's certainly very convenient for everyone that Steve's friend Sam just so happens to dislike the Accords and Tony's friend Rhodey just so happens to like them. But let's imagine a hypothetical situation where Sam and Rhodey's positions on the law were reversed. I think a solid case could be made for the fact that if push really came to shove, Falcon and War Machine would have ended up helping their respective man-friends anyway. And I think we know this because that's exactly what Black Widow ends up doing in this film. Natasha supports the Accords and thinks that fighting them is a dumb idea that will make things worse, but when it really matters, she puts her faith in Steve instead of Tony. And this makes sense to us because on top of it being the right thing to do in that situation, let's be honest that she probably likes Steve more than she likes Tony. Like, sorry Tony, that's just how it was. We saw Natasha in Captain America 2 where she was very impressed by Steve, and also in Iron Man 2 where she was not impressed by Tony, and all this has carried over to this moment for her. This is coherency writ large. Now, we don't see this type of personalized motivation with absolutely every single cameo in this film, but it's there with quite a lot of characters anyway. Hawkeye, for instance, does not utter a single cogent opinion about the Accords here, but he shows up anyway because he cares about Wanda. Even with Secretary Ross, like, yeah, we know he genuinely believes that superheroes should be managed by the government. But we also know the reason he believes this is because his daughter was the Hulk's girlfriend, so even he is not coming into this situation with an untainted perspective. That's the other thing I like about how this film depicts personal stakes. Like, it's good to have those for the sake of coherent, engaging characters, but this story also shows that having a personal stake in something isn't necessarily a good thing. There's a big thematic focus in Greek mythology and Greek tragedy on the concept of fate and how external forces can influence our lives in ways outside of our control, set us toward outcomes we have no way to avoid. At the exact same time, though, there's also a focus on someone's personal hubris, their fatal flaw, which is a very internal force that's largely within your control, that actually causes the most problems for you when it matters the most. It's ironic that the Trojan War has this reputation of being that time in Greek myths when the gods super instigated a war and Hela intervened in mortal affairs, which definitely happened, but that kinda undersells just how much of these characters' problems were self-inflicted anyway. In the Iliad, King Agamemnon did not have to act like a massive knob again and again, leading to many of the story's major conflicts. No one, no god, made him do that. Likewise, the warrior Achilles did not have to respond to Agamemnon's shenanigans with rage quitting and then corpse defilement. Like, that one's on you, buddy. You didn't have to do that. On the other hand, what is Achilles if not a turbo-angry super soldier? Who is this character without his pride and his rage? Sure, Agamemnon and Achilles could have saved everyone a lot of trouble if they weren't impossibly stubborn, but if they weren't impossibly stubborn, they wouldn't be Agamemnon and Achilles in the first place. So there's a dichotomy in these stories where your tragic fate is kinda set in stone by the universe itself. But it's also not really set in stone, because all you have to do to avoid this tragic fate is to adjust your stanky attitude, which is unfortunately really hard to do for most people, which brings us right back around to square one. And maybe that's what this notion of fate really represents. It's a depressing thesis on the fact that people can't really change their natures. One of the lessons of any tragedy is that it's easy for people who aren't in these characters' sandals to be judgmental about their choices, which you're only able to do because you're not in their position. Like, dude, why do you care so much about this thing? Oh, sorry, you want me to stop caring? Cool, thanks, I'll just do that thing. Good talk. Super helpful. Because, see, the most dangerous fatal flaws are the ones that seem good in moderation. Pride, conviction, anger, even love. These can be pretty good traits situationally, but lead to tragedy in excess. The Avengers, en masse, are not good at talking things out. They are not good at conflict resolution. They are not good at diplomacy, compromises, and half measures. They're all a bunch of type A tryhards who don't take no's for answers and would rather spend their time punching things instead of talking and make no apologies about it. Heck, for all that Tony talks about amendments and working with the system and comes across as the level-headed one through much of this film, it's important to remember that he's ultimately just as rigid as Steve and gets just as ornery when things don't go the way he likes. But this relentlessness is what makes the Avengers good Avengers. The fact that they don't like compromises means that they are stalwart. It means they don't accept defeat and they don't give up. The fact that they like punching more than talking means that they are really good at punching, and both previous Avengers films show that no matter how badly they get along, and they can get along pretty badly, they still can and will get the job done nonetheless. For better or for worse, they are fighters. When things go wrong, they default to fighting as a solution, which usually works for them. Part of the tragedy of Civil War is that the Avengers were not broken or diminished during these events. This is them operating at peak capacity, working as intended. As far as Steve goes, it's honestly really lucky for him that Zemo did turn out to be behind everything, cause all this, could have turned out much worse than it did. Being reckless about Bucky or anything else generally pays off for Steve cause he's really good at being reckless, and it endears him to us because we stan a proactive superhero. But he's still being reckless, and it's understandable when folks like Tony call him out on it here. But again, the only reason that Tony gets to mount that high horse is because he's not personally invested in Bucky's fate. Possibly my favorite takeaway from Civil War is that taking the high road sounds real good when it doesn't actually affect you, or when it even works in your favor. Isn't it so easy to talk ideology and rationality and accountability when the stakes aren't personal? Every pro-Accords character can roll their eyes and lecture at Steve from their lofty angle about how irresponsible he's being on Bucky's behalf, but let's not be fooled that they wouldn't also just throw out all sense and sensibility to do whatever impulsive, irresponsible thing they want to do the minute that something becomes personal for them. So all of these elements, these characters' abstract ideologies, their personal attachments, their greatest strengths doubling as their greatest weaknesses, work in tandem to construct an unavoidable conflict, which sucks for them but is great for the film because you need conflict in a story, which is often engineered through character flaws. Audiences are generally okay with flawed characters. What they tend to be less Gucci about are stupid characters, who run the risk of turning unavoidable conflicts into forced conflicts. You definitely don't want your conflicts to feel forced, and now I don't want to oversell Civil War, make it sound like literally everything was flawlessly executed here, which isn't the case, but I think it does a great job of constructing a tragic situation that couldn't just have been easily avoided. And that goes a long way towards making our mastermind antagonist, Helmut Zemo, come across as a very fascinating character. Yes, his name is Helmut. I unironically approve. Love it. No notes. In the Iliad's 5th century BC fanfiction sequel, the Oresteia, Agamemnon's son Orestes gets pursued by the Furies, spirit goddesses of vengeance, because he was infamously compelled to murder his own mother Clytemnestra because she had infamously killed his father, Agamemnon, because Agamemnon had infamously killed their daughter, Iphigenia. And if that's not enough vengeance for one story, don't forget that Clytemnestra didn't exact her revenge alone. Her lover, Aegisthus, helped her in this deed because Agamemnon's father, Atreus, had, among other things, killed Aegisthus's brothers. And then Orestes kills Aegisthus too. It mostly works out okay for him though, don't worry. In these mythic stories, vengeance is the ultimate personal stake. It is an insatiable driving force that demands gratification and engenders yet more vengeance. The House of Atreus is mighty and unassailable. Kingdoms and armies have crumbled before them for all the mythic age, but they come very close to falling from within, from their own infighting and their inability to stem the cycle of vengeance. And in Captain America: Civil War, no one understands these equations more than Zemo. See, Zemo's family was killed, but he can't simply pull an Orestes or an Aegisthus and just kill the person responsible. Not only is that person already gone, Zemo himself doesn't have the power to just go up to these superhuman mythic beings and stab them in the face. So what happens to his vengeance? The cycle has nowhere to go, its relentless flow has been blocked, and can only simmer within Zemo himself. And that won't do. Zemo, more than anyone, knows that vengeance has to be answered with vengeance. Blood must pay for blood. That's just how it is. And so he redirects the flow of the river onto someone else, so that the cycle endures. The Avengers didn't kill Zemo's family, although there is a case to be made that they, and more so Tony and Wanda, are responsible for what happened. There is a difference, and it's big enough to make Zemo's motivations merely understandable and not actually justified. But it ultimately doesn't really matter. Vengeance is not about the reasonable response, but the gratifying response. And sometimes that means righting wrongs in exactly proportional ways, and sometimes it doesn't. Through the eyes of the Furies, there is only the cycle. There are no extenuating circumstances, there is no shifting the blame just because something isn't actually technically your fault. Which, ironically, is similar to Steve's position earlier in the film, one that Bucky supports. Hydra are the ones who made Bucky kill Tony's parents. Bucky's not responsible for the deed, but he did do it. He did kill them. Is that a big enough distinction that Tony's response is understandable, if not actually justified? Well, I think there could have been a theoretical version of this moment somewhere out there in the vast expanses of the multiverse, where Tony might have reacted better here with more sympathy, more restraint. But in this heated moment, in this mythic story, with all of Tony's family history and unresolved guilt stacking the odds against him, vengeance won out. It demanded a response, proportional or otherwise. And no one blames Tony for it, they get it. Again, who's to say what anyone else would have done in this position, how anyone else would react? And so the cycle continues.
Oh, boo-hoo! My wife and child are dead. Oh, I don't care if it's mean. Everybody's got dead people. It's no excuse to get everybody else dead along the way.
Enter Black Panther. Of all the characters, T'Challa and his father might be the least culpable for anything in this big ol' hootenanny. They didn't cause mass casualties, they didn't kill anyone's parents, here. They're as close as you can be to actual innocent bystanders in this whole mess. T'Challa's claim to retribution is certainly the most understandable and justified. He could have killed Zemo here with zero stains on his conscience. But at some point, someone has to break this cycle. It's not that Zemo doesn't need to account for his crimes, but at some point one of these fighters, these Avengers, has to stop avenging, stop giving in to the fixation that blood must pay for blood, murder must compel more murder, and that the onus to enforce this somehow falls upon the least impartial person left standing. At the end of the Oresteia, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, decrees that the old ways of vengeance have gone on long enough. Instead of there being endless series of retaliations and blood feuds, all personal grievances would instead be settled through courts and trials and civic processes. There would be order, there would be justice. It's far from a perfect solution, and it's especially not an easy solution. Athena basically prevails upon the Furies to stop being the Furies, to take on new roles and change their entire nature. And all the Clytemnestras and all the Aegistuses out there who had legitimate grievances now have to trust in this new impersonal clinical system to get justice for them, which is also easier said than done. But if the high road were easy to walk, everyone would be walking it. I mean, superheroes can be kind of trigger-happy in the MCU. There are a couple of notable instances where a hero shows mercy when they can, but otherwise it's almost expected that villains don't tend to survive their confrontations in these films. And most of the time it is understandable or even justified that they don't. What I like about T'Challa's choice here, though, is that it shows us how important it can be to walk that higher, harder road by showing us the alternative, by showing us what happens when we don't. In this story, vengeance is the path of least resistance. It is the default response. It is the fated course. And to prevail against vengeance in this context is to prevail against the fates themselves. And that there's a lot of fancy-sounding talk about themes and ideologies, but remember what we learned today, everyone. While ideologies can be interesting, they can't support a story without emotional stakes. Civil War is a movie with ideology, but it's more about personal emotions, personal grief, and how those things force these volatile characters into conflict with each other. Is it possible to have a really good, really captivating story that mostly neglects character stakes and instead focuses on their impersonal ideologies? I don't know. Never say never, right? But I will say that those stories probably aren't going to be my favorites.